Hi, everyone. Welcome to Food Talk Live. I'm Danny Nierenberg, president and co-founder of Food Tank. I'm really excited to have the second discussion of our 5-part live stream series about the Refresh Working Group's Food Plus Tech policy platform. The Refresh Working Group is a multi-stakeholder platform made up of farmers, academics, entrepreneurs, chefs, advocates, technologists, and other experts who wish to explore the complex intersection of agriculture, food, and technology. Over the 4 remaining days of this series, my co-host Chloe Sorvino, who leads coverage of food and agriculture at Forbes, and I will ask our panelists about ways to educate policymakers, how to advocate for thoughtful, intentional policies governing technology, and the need for participatory development of technologies to solve the problems and develop solutions that farmers and eaters actually need. You can access yesterday's discussion on supply chain transparency at foodtank.com. Our second discussion today will focus on broadband expansion in the policy platform. And again, that platform is available at foodtank.com. 25% of the rural population of the United States lacks broadband service at speeds that will serve communities well. Many communities lack infrastructure for high-speed internet, and many service providers ignore rural communities despite the tremendous need and opportunity that exists there. Farmers, especially during the pandemic, need broadband now probably more than ever before to connect them to new markets and allow them to find new ways to reach customers. To address these challenges and many others, we have a great panel, and I will introduce them all briefly, but you can find their bios online. We have Michelle Miller, the Associate Director of the Center for Integrated Agricultural Systems at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's also a member of the Refresh Working Group. We have Leanna Mulvihill, the Product Manager of Customer Engagement at Farm Generations Co-op. That was the CEO of that is Lindsay Lucier-Shute, who is also a member of the Refresh Working Group, and Ankita Raturi, an assistant professor at Purdue University and also a member of the working group. Thank you all so much for being here. It's truly an honor to have your expertise. We might have another panelist join us, and I'll introduce her when she comes on. So Chloe, I kind of want to throw it over to you for the first question.
Thank you, Danny. Yes, yesterday was such a powerful conversation, and I'm looking forward to today's. In an agribusiness climate where large players squeeze the few independents left, access to digital marketplaces and social media can truly be make or break for a farm, which is why it is such a massive inequity in our country that so many don't have strong access to make use of all the technology available. This is a crucial issue. It has been for a very long time, and it's been perennially brought up, including in today's confirmation hearing for Tom Bislak. So I'm sure we'll get to that a little bit later. But for now, this panel today will address how issues of access to broadband can be solved and how simple changes could impact farmers. And I do also want to introduce that Kim is here. Thank you, Kim. I am really so excited you're getting to join us. You are a retired Navy veteran, Navy general. I'm going to let Danny introduce you, but
So Kim, thank you, Chloe. Kim, so glad you could join us.
My pleasure.
It's really an honor to have you. Kim Olson is a retired U.S. Air Force, retired from the U.S. Air Force, and was a Democratic nominee for Texas Agricultural Commissioner. Thank you so much for joining us, Kim.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks, Danny. Okay, so to kick off this panel, I'd love for each of you to briefly explain how you first got involved in farming and how you were introduced to the issue of broadband access.
Ankita, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. So I actually have a background in informatics, and a lot of my early work was really focused around technology and the design of technology to assist in a variety of different kinds of sustainable practices. And I was drawn to farming as one of these spaces in which I think we can actually design things that might be useful for a large group of folks. So out in California, I started driving through the Central Valley, up and down the coast, talking to farmers, listening to their stories, visiting with them to try to get a better sense of how information tools were being used in their practice of agriculture, especially in the small scale, right? And so it was one of those things where, as a naive grad student, I went in thinking, yeah, we'll figure out what the challenges are. We'll build a bunch of tools. It'll be great. And then you listen to the stories and you realize that it's a lot more complicated than that. There are large, massive infrastructural challenges that people face. So even when there is an urge to move away from paper, there are a lack of things that support that type of activity. And so I think that experience really shaped my thinking when it came to how we design tools, and so ever since then, the first thing I always think to myself whenever I'm designing something new is it has to be available offline first. So you always need to build in that capability because you can't guarantee that there's always going to be internet connectivity, or you have to think about all of these other sort of community-based and infrastructural challenges that people might face when they're using different kinds of technology. So that was a little bit about my intro. And it's very much shaped the way in which I have approached the design of technology within 4 communities ever since.
Michelle, are you ready?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I guess I first got involved in farming because I really wanted to farm. During the farm crisis of the early 1980s, my intention was to go work on the family farm after college, but they lost the farm during that time. And so that's how I ended up getting involved in sustainable agriculture work. As far as internet connectivity, the issue really hit me when I was heading to North Dakota for a family reunion, and our map function, our GPS function dropped, and our phone wasn't working, and I hadn't brought a map with me. And I realized how little connectivity there is in a lot of rural areas. We ended up finding broadband access at a truck stop in North Dakota. The state had set up access at all these different truck stops, like wayside stops, not like gas and services stop, but just basic wayside stops. And then it dawned on me, this is what we're having to do is bootstrap access for rural people. So since then, we do a lot of work with rural people and are finding that a lot of them during COVID have been doing things like sitting in their trucks in a parking lot somewhere to be able to access meetings, to get on Zoom and join in the conversations that are really critical to rural Americas. So I'd love to see universal access so that isn't such an issue anymore.
Thank you so much. Leanna, can you go next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Leanna. I started farming 10 years ago and personally experienced really poor broadband connection in rural places and have definitely camped out at the laundromat for Wi-Fi. And now I work for From Generations Cooperative, and I get to talk to farmers all the time about their technology needs. And they're all telling me, like, can it work offline? Am I going to lose sales if I lose connection? So that's something I'm hearing about farmers all over the country who are encountering this as part of their daily routine.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Kim.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. So I come from a long line of farmers. We still have farms in Iowa that sell commodity crops. And then, of course, I farm down here on a sustainable farm in Texas. And as you mentioned, I ran for ag commissioner in 2018 and traveled to 244 counties in our great state, and mostly rural Texas. And for those of you that are watching to understand Texas, let me just put in perspective. Texas is 5 Georgias. So I just want you to know the breadth of rural communities that exist out there. And in my work of visiting with farmers on their fields and family dinner tables and on their tractors, one thing was clear is that it seems like there's this massive rural-urban divide, and much of that can be bridged by leveraging the technology, but you can't do AI, you can't do buddy tractors, you can't do anything until you have broadband internet to those folks out there. And until we answer those questions, and not just from an ag point of view, but also just from an access point of view to markets, to especially in COVID, to telehealth. And now, of course, obviously, city folks are feeling this too with having to educate your children online. And so if any time in our nation, and y'all remember, Texas was the place that started the electrification of rural America with our president back then, Johnson. And I think it is the time that we, brandification or broadbandification, if you will, if I can, abuse a word here, all of rural America. It is just, it should be a public utility, just like water and electricity, full stop. And I think that is an incredible bipartisan thing that we can do today in this country, and it's needed. So thank you for having me.
Thank you all so much. And I love that point about this should be a bipartisan issue. Ankita and Leanna, I'd like to go back to you. Ankita, you said something very important about listening to the stories that farmers were telling you and not just going in with a tool or an innovation that could help them. And sometimes, paper is best, and you have to sort of accept that, whether we're talking about, North America or the global South. And Leanna, you said the same thing about, how it has to work offline as well. And I'm wondering if we can get into that a little bit more. What are you both hearing from farmers about what works best? I mean, from my viewpoint and from what I've heard, it's often a combination of things, right? It's the paper and it's the online access. But what sorts of things, Ankita is in Indiana, you're in the Hudson Valley, Leanna. So I'm wondering, from both of your perspectives, what kind of works?
I'm happy to at least chat from a design perspective what we've been taking into consideration. So a lot of my work after my first foray into the California ag scene, I moved out east to Maryland, and there started looking at tools for cover crops. Really trying to think about how we can design decision support tools for folks to adopt cover crops. And now in my current work, I look still at each of these two things, but now also looking at the way in which we can design tools for local food systems. And the things that I keep hearing in all of my conversations with, and I give you this diversity to say this is a challenge across sizes, across commodity types. This is sort of like, at least from my perspective, it seems like these are universal challenges that different farmers face. And it requires tools that are, and I mentioned offline first, right? So people do want access to data that is relevant, that is timely, that is site specific. But you also need to take into consideration the fact that you can't be downloading massive imagery every couple of minutes. There need to be ways in which you're caching this data so you can use it then later. And so there is a lot of interest and I think desire for things like edge analytics, where you are actually doing computing on these devices in a way that it's not requiring callbacks to a server over and over again. Another thing that seems unrelated and innocuous at first, but I think is super important, is this idea of building tools that are mobile friendly. Because, and I think, Kim, you mentioned this idea that folks are sitting in tractors. And I think, Michelle, you might've mentioned, in fact, all of you did, right? People are sitting in all sorts of unusual spaces, looking at their tools and trying to interact with a variety of different technologies. And most importantly, they're actually trying to do work, which means that I want tools that are on this device, on these sorts of devices, to be just as useful as the tools we have for entertainment. And that requires both the infrastructural things that we're looking at, but then also for us to design things that will scale to different kinds of devices, that will work on like the ancient computer that is sitting in the back of your cab or on Internet Explorer still sometimes. And so, you need to be thinking about this range of platforms, this range of users, and making sure that you're not necessarily creating this like highly prescriptive route through a particular piece of technology. So those are at least a couple of things that come to mind when I'm thinking about designing tools for farmers in connectivity challenged areas.
Great, thanks so much, Leanna. Thoughts?
Yeah, we're doing a lot of the same things in our work. Caching data so that it is available when it's offline is a big deal. And we've built our platform Grown By so that there is a web browser app, but there's also a mobile app because people are on their phones and sometimes your smartphone is the only way you're getting on the internet in a rural place. And it's been something people have been concerned about, like, please don't put too many videos in there so that it doesn't take forever to load. So I've had farmers explicitly ask for that. And we also work to accept offline payments so that you don't necessarily need to have a credit card and pay online. You can write a check, you can bring cash. So that's something that's built into Grown By.
Thank you. Michelle, this question's for you. You've studied landscape architecture. Given this training, what are some of the reasons broadband isn't available to rural farmers? I'm sure there are so many variety of reasons, and I'd love to understand the overview.
Sure. Well, a big part of it is landscape. In our region, there's a 4-state large region that has is very hilly, a lot of valleys, not a lot of cities. The big towns are very small. And so there just really isn't a place for, it's very difficult to get internet service into those coulees. Other issues are around density of population. So where it's not dense enough, companies aren't interested in providing services because there's no money to be made in it. And so to earlier points made, it really needs to be a public utility to be able to reach some of those areas where you're not going to make any money on it, but it's still very important for rural development. I also wanted to just touch really briefly on something in the earlier question, and that was around the importance of connectivity for rural people in general. I've heard a lot of people say that since COVID, they can't really even tell the difference because they have a stay-at-home mentality anyway, so it's not different for them at all. It's really important for rural people to have an opportunity to collaborate and to share knowledge and to build an understanding of where they want to go and how they're going to get there. And we have a citizen science project with cover cropping, with farmers who use cover crops. And we've been having them enter data and aggregate that data and then help show them the patterns so that they can learn from one another. But without, really good access to internet, that makes it harder for those people to participate.
Can I riff off of that a little bit?
Absolutely.
I think one of the things that always strikes me about technology is when we talk about tools, we often think about them as tools for work, but they're also tools for community, right? So I grew up in remote islands in the South Pacific. And for me, the internet was my way to communicate with the rest of the world. It was my way to learn new things and feel like I was part of something. And so I feel like I have a lot of empathy for folks who live in rural communities and somebody who now does live in a rural space, right? It's one of those things where the internet is supposed to help you be connected to larger groups of things, right? Especially through COVID, we've been seeing so many different kinds of educational materials and webinars and so many different kinds of things being available specifically tailored for different groups. I think it's a really powerful thing to remember that this is, at the end of the day, a means for us to communicate with each other just as we're doing today. And that shouldn't be lost in the midst of thinking about all of the potential, all the other things we can do with the tools.
That's a fantastic point. Kim, I'm wondering if you can talk about this a little. Michelle talked about how this is a way for rural folks to share knowledge. Ankita mentioned that point as well. But you have often said that rural Texas feels forgotten. And I'm wondering how broadband access can make those folks feel valued and not forgotten.
And that's a really good question. And I would offer that I would imagine the rest of the rural America feels that way sometimes too, that all the focuses, the resources, the populations exist in these large urban and suburban settings. And then rural folks, just sort of provide the resources, but don't get anything back. And to your point, because there's not a lot of money to be made, Michelle, that's one of the reasons I think it has to be public utility. And so in my work with both talking with rural farmers, and that I am a rural farmer with cover crops, and I'm part of a science project, Michelle, around bees. So y'all are speaking to my hearts here around that. I think a couple things, rural America and rural towns, if you travel to them, sometimes are dying, and the town figuratively and literally. And that is because a lot of times hospitals have to close because they can't sustain themselves. So here's a example of where in Texas, 16 rural hospitals closed. And then we had COVID, and it's like, oh my gosh, had we had the access to internet and broadband, we could have done tons of telemedicine without making people travel, 1, 2, and 3 hours. I'm a combat vet. Many veterans live in the rural areas because they go back home. Their access to the veterans, the VA system tends to be very far away, obviously in urban settings. And so therefore their access to medical help. And the other thing I will tell you about, and this is very interesting, and if we could do any plug for broadband, it would be this, you all. In the space that I work with vets, what we noted was that the suicide rate actually decreased during COVID. Let me pause for dramatic effect. It decreased. And the reason is because we provided mental health services across the internet, that they didn't have to go and sit in some waiting room, travel hours. People had within 30 minutes access to a counselor, which they are finding exists. So, I mean, in a way, COVID has opened up a space within the medical providing, if you will, services that with unintended consequences that were great. And so I think we have really concrete examples of why broadband is not just good from a social point of view, it's good from a health point of view, it's good from an economic point of view. And I'll make one last point, if I may, Danielle, is that I was on a food security for Austin ISD. Okay, so Austin, oh my gosh, the breadbasket of where we can get any kind of food you want. But they have food insecurity and food deserts, which you all have heard about, in urban settings. But because of the internet capacity that they have around that state capital, they were able to close that I'm the farmer with food that normally would go to restaurants who can't use it right now. And we were able to pivot that and take food and go into the ISD school systems and feed kids and, most importantly, families. So we took urban needs and we solved it with rural folks. That's why it's a bridge. It's not a stovepipe. It's a bridge between rural and urban settings. And I'm sorry, I just get all spun up about this because this is just what we have to do in this country to help those folks that live out where we need them to live, where, resources are provided. And so, and if you ask me one last thing about rural, and I'm sorry, just let me finish this one last point. Look, broadband internet to rural America is about saving the environment. Once again, I'm going to pause for dramatic effect, y'all, because AI, which is artificial intelligence, we now have the capability to load up drones, read fields, understand what needs nitrogen, what needs what side, herbicides. I'm organic, so I don't really like that stuff, but we still do it in our commodity crops. And then only put those kinds of inputs on the parts of the plants that actually need it instead of spraying it everywhere and then it runs into our soil and our water and the whole 9 yards. But no one can buy an agricultural drone to do that yet unless they have broadband internet. And if you want to save the environment, then give rural people access to broadband internet and they can buy these incredible technological tools that we have out there to use inputs in a much safer, less, and oh, by the way, farmer, which is what they care about, least expensive way per acre, full stop.
That's amazing. Chloe, before I throw it to you, Kim, I'm so sorry that you didn't become agriculture commissioner. You should be.
Me too, damn it. I'd have done a hell of a job for Texas.
Kim, thank you so much. I just wanted to bring up two of the points you mentioned because they actually related to what we were talking about yesterday. You talked about health and the nutritional access is huge there. We heard yesterday all about how so many of the folks who need food boxes sent to them and are getting access through programs, it's mainly because they are having a health issue in their family. So that plus climate change, I think it just really shows how all of this is so interrelated and it has to come from a community basis. So I think with that, I would hope everyone on this panel can maybe address this next question. How can broadband access increase resilience in our food system from just even the smallest point to on the macro side of things? Michelle, Leanna, anyone?
I'll take a try at that. So one of the ways that I think it will increase resilience is by increasing transparency. And I know you talked about transparency in supply chains yesterday, and that's a great way of describing it. We've got a need for fairness to be brought back to the food system. And part of that relies on really good communication and information flow. And a lot of times rural people are cut off from the information flow. And it really starts from the processor point of view all the way to the retailer, and the farmer sitting there going, where's price transparency? I don't know how much my milk is really getting in the marketplace. I don't even know what kind of cheese it's made into. So those kinds of issues I think are really critical. And without good broadband, it'll be harder to bring farmers into that information flow for transparency throughout the supply chain.
Yeah, with Grown By, we're helping farmers sell directly to consumers. So we're diversifying your food supply. I don't know how many of you this spring experienced like going to the grocery store and there wasn't food there. And all of the farmers, virtually all of the farmers that I've talked to in the last 6 to 9 months have been selling out in ways that they haven't before. And it's because they're getting online because people are looking online for different places to buy their food. So having a diversity of local producers makes it easier for everybody when the supply chains are shorter.
Yeah, and I just want to say from an economics perspective there, that brand is what gets a farmer out of the commodity system and gets them to be able to pay a higher premium for what they've worked so hard to grow. So I think it's hugely important from a decommodification perspective as well.
I think this topic is, at least for me, pretty close to my heart because during COVID, I think one of the things we started was a project around informatics for community food resilience, specifically trying to think about how can we design appropriate technologies with communities to be able to actually try to help with some of these resilience challenges that we've seen highlighted during the pandemic. And so one of the things that at least comes to mind based on the things that folks have mentioned so far is this idea of the democratization of a supply chain. It gives people agency when you are able to go to alternative methods of selling, right? If you're no longer able, and this is something we heard a lot from folks that we were talking to during last year's research that we were doing, we would hear folks describe how they're unable to sell direct to institutions anymore. So now how do they find new markets? It was a lot of using the internet. I saw a lot of, pictures of hogs being sold on Reddit during the crisis that we saw in North Carolina, because there were no other ways in which people were able to find new markets. And so there's this tension between, yes, we need access to the internet, and yes, we need infrastructure, but we also need tools, and we also need training to be able to allow people to then take advantage of these things. So I only want to bring these pieces because I think, we need the internet in different places. We need broadband in rural communities, but then we also need these other pieces side by side. So that way it's not just also then providing pipes without necessarily providing all the other infrastructure in addition to that. Yeah.
And if I could dovetail on that from, again, my military point of view, I would offer to you that access to food and food security is a national security issue. And because when you can't feed your population, it becomes quite unstable. Be a student of history and watch that. And so it seems to me that when we have environmental issues that flood fields or cause a commodity to get taken out of the market, or a loss of it, like the pork that you talked about, or when we had trade wars and we cut off our markets that we normally sell things to, that there needs to be something of an umbrella looking at the strategic impact. And when I was on the food conference last week, one of the sad things I learned in running for agriculture is a lot of times we just have a logistics issue. 40% of the food that we grow in this nation gets pitched. And it was interesting when this first started out and you had those large warehouses of distribution that couldn't get their food out the door because there were no restaurants that were ordering because everybody was shut down. Many places, and I'm going to use an example again back to Austin, where there was an incubator of a woman who she would bring people in and they learn how to cook, whether they be caterers or restaurants. And she pivoted that entire organization to help prepare meals. She does 30,000 meals a day. And then Houston ISD, here's an example, in this conference last week, she has 254 franchise basically. But what it is they're kitchens or restaurants that build full foods based on the USDA criteria, and then she pushes those out ready to eat, heat and go to the families in Houston, and it's millions of food. So not only are we feeding families, but again, like I talked about earlier, we've closed that loop between the grower, the people that have to warehouse it, and then getting it into kitchens where it can be made into food. And especially if you've ever worked around a food bank, which we have, many times when we give them things, they don't have the means to cook it. So the best thing we can do is send out prepared meals. But you can't have that if you don't have that system to talk to one another. Like you all said, it's a communication logistics problem that we have. And
is that Joy Chevalier, by the way?
Yes, it is. My dear sweet friend who I ran with. I love Joy. Cook's Nook, and I gotta give her credit on that. They really work hard. And here's the other thing, and we haven't talked about this yet, Danielle, but may I jump on this? You know, we have farmers, let's just take the Valley, you know, down here in Texas, in which many of the farmers grow high value asset crops, you know, with tight, large. But the problem is when you have the lack of workers to pick them, because we don't have the technology yet, and you have to have workers, and it's a skill set. I went out when I was running for ag and picked cabbage with the women in the field. I lasted about 8 minutes. They do it for 8 hours. And so there is a skill set in picking these high value crops that you like. You know, you like your asparagus, you like your cabbage, that stuff all gets handpicked. Then you're going to have to pay, you know, a quarter more. Get over it, people. You know, you're throwing away 40% of the food you bring in your house anyway. Let's be better about the food we bring in and where it ends up. And so I just think we need a decent immigration policy that allows for workers to come in and pick our crops and work in the fields and own land, or do, you know, not just immigration for crops, but, you know, there's docks we have to immigrate into. But I'm just saying we need workers to do that. And that's one of the reasons we struggle and turn under crops in the field, is because we couldn't get them out of the field in time, especially last season was really tough in the Valley for us. We left, I think it was like, you know, a quarter of the citrus crop got left on the trees. It was really sad. And that means everybody down that supply chain lost out. So.
Absolutely. Really great points, all of you. Bernie, my co-founder who's doing the back end, can you bring up the comment that was from someone named Rachel, please? I thought it was really valuable. So Rachel wanted to note, this is for our listeners who aren't able to see the screen, that oftentimes rural areas do have access to the internet, but there's a monopoly of poor choices, choosing between 2 satellite providers offering, you know, $160 a month is unfair. And I just think this is such a critical point to bring up when there's very few companies and little competition. So any comments on that before I move on to the next question?
I think whenever I agree with Rachel's comment. I think it is unfortunate the situation that we're in, and I think Kim mentioned this right at the beginning, that the internet, this should be a public utility. I think whenever I think back to the history of computing and how the internet was brought about, it was supposed to be, right? It was supposed to be this beautiful thing that people could access. It was supposed to be freely accessible. It was supposed to be something that encouraged equitable access. And it was this beautiful dream that we had. And unfortunately, some of the things that we have done since have hamstrung our ability to be able to take advantage of the internet in the ways that we used to. I would hope that we have better regulations in place to be able to support different people being able to access the internet, to protect people's privacy and digital rights and those types of things, but also make sure that we have alternative options when thinking about access to the internet, especially thinking about it as a utility more than anything else. So I just wanted to throw that comment out there in response.
And I will say that within those that work in the drone world, you can tell I'm into drones here. It's because they're unmanned flights. But anyway, they now have drones they can throw up that will give you about 700 square miles of cellular service. And so you can put a drone up at about 14,000 feet and it'll just sit there. It seems to me we could do those same kinds of things. And of course, you all know about the network that Elon Musk is trying to do with the satellites to cover the entire world. You know, you got to hand it to forward-thinking folks. So sometimes private and public partnership can work the best, to your point. And I think that needs to be done. And we have an incredible opportunity in this. Those that make policy ought to be people who've had to grow and sell commodity. I just believe that in my soul, is if you're going to sit at the table and advocate for that, you better have gotten your hands dirty, literally.
I'd like to riff off that. Back in the 30s, when rural electrification went in, it did so because the administration, the Roosevelt administration, asked farm organizations to pitch in on developing some policies. And farmers really thought rural electrification co-ops were the way to go. And that was made possible because the administration made space for that and really encouraged it and helped it to happen. And we're at that point where we've been talking about internet access for at least a decade, if not longer. And it's time now for the administration to be thinking about this as really a Build Back Better effort and put some support and some muscle behind conversations and action to make this a utility and provide universal access.
That's great. Chloe, if you don't mind, I just want to go back to this point about that was brought up earlier by Kim and direct us towards you, Michelle, about mental health. Farmers were having such a hard time in the United States before COVID. And I feel like COVID has only exacerbated, a lot of the stresses on farmers, particularly in our rural areas in the United States. How can we, address that? You talked about having more, we have these workshops online, but I'm really wondering how we can use broadband access to increase mental health services for farmers.
It's a great idea and absolutely needed. And as Kim had said, that online access to medical care of whatever kind can really make a big difference for rural people. I want to bring it to a justice point too, in that about 50% of Native Americans live in rural and sometimes extremely rural areas, and they are really underserved. And if we want to, recognize that that group of people and provide, this is a really critical piece of doing that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Michelle, for bringing up the indigenous population in the United States that has continually been underserved and disparaged for centuries in this country. So real justice does need to happen, including reparations and all of the things that we're just beginning to talk about publicly for the first time that are so exciting. Chloe, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, I actually want to keep with that point because we're talking a lot about the rural-urban divide, but it also is just the same that 40% of residents in Detroit don't have access to broadband either, and that obviously hugely impacts local food and farming businesses there, from all the different bee startups I know of, and so many more. So as we're rethinking food systems and the role that technology plays, and talking about what broadband access, potentially as a public utility could do, I'd love to hear more from the folks on this panel about how institutional barriers and systemic racism that have shaped our food system for so long can really, make sure that what policies are put forward for broadband, that what's being built doesn't make the same mistakes as before.
That's a pretty big question, but I might start with just a little tiny couple of things. I think affordability of access to the internet is a pretty big one. A lot of ways the digital divide is what it is because of the different kinds of privilege the different groups have. And so trying to make sure that when we are designing infrastructure to take into account the diversity of people's needs, diversity of their pockets, and making sure that we're actually listening to what people actually want in different spaces. That means solutions might look different for different kinds of communities, and we can't always have a policy that's a one-size-fits-all, though it is always helpful to have guidelines that can then be followed in different spaces. And so I just wanted to put in this point about affordability and making sure that things are, that we are listening to specific communities, especially those that are underserved.
Yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to actually bring up from the earlier point as well. We've been talking about public utilities, but just to make the economic point, I think a public utility really is needed because the private partnerships haven't been able to give accessible price points and a diversity of price points or fair price points for so long. And it's been talking about a decade. So that's really where things have to move from here.
If I can add one more piece then, the concept of a technocracy always, I think, worries me when we try to think about what the role of technology can be in society. And so also taking into account that when we design systems that I know we've all read or have been hearing a lot about, books like Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, right? And so there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from others who actually look at what potential role technology can and should not sometimes play in our communities. And so as opposed to giving policy advice myself, I would point to the works of others who have thought deeply about how we can try to make sure that we are not falling prey to the mistakes of our predecessors in the design of technology for local communities.
And I think when you talk about justice and equality, especially for underserved groups or disenfranchised groups in the rural areas, I think you have to talk about access to capital. And this was one thing I heard a lot about when I would travel, is how difficult it is for certain communities to have loans, to get reasonable grants from the government, even though, you know, all that money that comes out of the government is our money. It goes there as our taxes, and it should come back to us. It's not the government's money. And so that was one of the complaints that I heard, in the incredible sometimes rules and how cumbersome it is for many communities to fill out the respective grants or the means of getting funds. It's just, I mean, I got 3 master's degrees, and there are days I'm like, what? Oh my gosh, you got to hire a grant writer to help you out, which is insane. And the last thing, and I'm going to go back to trying to save our environment. Here was an excellent example. There was a farm that wanted to do underground irrigation, so where you lay the tapes underground, about 1 inch underground, and you would feed then the plants underground. But they couldn't get a loan for it. And the reason was, you want to take a guess? Because if they defaulted on the loan, they couldn't get the equipment back. So instead, we did the center point sprayer at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, in which 60% of the water gets evaporated out in West Texas. It's stuff like that that I think we need to work on, about when we give farmers who are trying to do innovative things around growing crops, especially as the resource of water where we live, you know, becomes more and more of a challenge for the kinds of crops we're trying to grow out here, that we're better about that. And again, having access to the broadband where you could read things like water usage would be a much better use of the resources. And then the funding that comes behind that, it makes it a little more comfortable from those that are in the lending platforms.
Any other thoughts, Michelle or Leanna?
So we're a technology company. We don't work on policy directly, but something that we've been working on is trying to make it so easier for our farmers to accept EBT online. And right now, it's really difficult to accept EBT online at all. In most states, it's only like Amazon and Walmart that can do it. So we've been working, our application is in process. Like we have not succeeded yet. And that's a big barrier. I talk to farmers all the time who are like, I would love to accept EBT, but the application process is too daunting. But if there was a way for us to make it streamlined and be able to accept EBT on their behalf, we would be giving farmers access to a new customer base who wants to spend their EBT benefits, and be giving farmers a way to serve their communities in ways that they're asking to.
Along the line that you were just saying, Leanna, I think it's really important that we understand that independent businesses need support to be able to collaborate, and that if you're a large integrated, vertically integrated business, you've got access to capital, you've got a way to spread your risk throughout the supply chain. But if you're an independent business serving a supply chain, that's another matter. And any kind of collaborative process, like the EBT situation you were talking about, Leanna, is really important to make it possible for independent businesses to stay independent, but still collaborate and collaborate horizontally.
Great thought. Okay, of course.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to go back to the EBT problem, because I think, Leanna, you and I have at least been thinking about the same thing a lot lately then. One of the things that we heard a lot last year, especially as farmers were going online, as marketplaces were going online, was that it was not possible for folks who were previously served by farmers markets, where there were good policies like double up bucks type of programs. Those folks could no longer go to a market because now the online marketplace did not accept EBT. And so it's one of those, it's an interesting example of a place where there was a really good policy in place that allowed for people to be able to access something that they could not previously. There was a technology that was introduced, but then that was not updated. And so it means that at least these days when I've been looking through, what are the barriers to actually getting EBT into some of these tools, it's because of certain kinds of things that are in the policy that makes it really difficult to know exactly how to implement it. And so it becomes a really complex design challenge that at least I and a lot of other folks in the open ag tech community have been talking about, to try to think about how can we resolve at least that one particular piece. But I think if you're trying to think of, the role of technology, the internet, and how these two come to meet inside food systems, EBT is the perfect example of how these things can get really, really messy. So thank you for bringing that up, Leanna.
We just had a great comment from Nicowana. Bernie, could you put that up? I'm sorry. I'm just reading it out loud for the folks who are listening. Would it be impractical to have a national farmer EBT umbrella, so not a national application, with the individual farmers as possible vendors as choices? Is that not allowed right now?
So my understanding is that the rules are different in every state. And when we've been looking into it, we're like, are we going to need to get, basically we need farmers who are accepting EBT in person already on their own to work with us. And we're not sure if we're going to need to have like farmers on the ground using our software and accepting EBT in every state to make us eligible, because they're all a little bit different. So at this time, the way the law is written, having a national application is so far outside of the current parameters, and it would be very dreamy if we could do that.
It would make the design of standardized technologies so much easier if it was true.
Chloe, do you want to go next? I have a question if you don't want to. I'm sure. You want to go? Gotcha. Okay, so we've been talking about EBT. Ankita has brought up this idea that there is no cookie cutter approach. There's no one size fits all. But now, we have a new administration with a new, the confirmation hearings were today, Chloe, you said, for Secretary Vilsack, who was previously the Secretary of Agriculture under the Obama administration. How do we convince folks like Vilsack, who has to rebuild a kind of dismantled USDA that's just been sort of broken over the last 4 years? How do we convince him of a couple of things? One, this idea of creating broadband as a public utility, and two, really address this EBT problem that is plaguing so many, will continue to plague folks after the pandemic. Are there any thoughts? I know we're not all policymakers, and some of you are shy about talking about policy, but maybe Kim, you can start.
Well, I would echo what I said earlier, is you better put people on the table who've gotten their hands dirty and actually had to sell food on the market. Put those people at the table. A great comment that the head of the Houston ISD said that, when you go to talk to folks about the Farm Bill, which has I forget, something like 70% of the money is around SNAP and feeding people in America. It seems to me you better have someone at the table that's had to serve meals to kids. And it's the same thing. Get your farmers at the table, because what he dealt with in the Obama administration is a hell of a lot different post, COVID. And I'll make a point is, and I'm back to it, food is a national security issue. If we cannot feed our own population, we become beholden, or we become susceptible to the nations that are feeding us, especially in that logistics train. And so I think having a sense of urgency around shoring up and doing whatever we can to keep our farmers alive. And I'll say, those of you that don't know, we've had more bankruptcies and farmers going out of business than any other basically any other work segment in our country. And so it's just beholden upon us as a nation to be able to continue to serve ourselves. And the largest, fastest growing farmer, if you will, is a woman. So you better put a female with gray hair or chemically altered gray hair on that table to talk about it. Because not only are we growing food now, we're bringing home the bacon and, that whole ordeal. But the point is that women are now becoming primary farmers in many of the lands they either inherit, or their husbands get too old, or they are stepping in. as maybe a secondary career. That's what we're finding. And many vets are farming. For whatever reason, we just, we like the big machinery. But the point is that there are different faces now that are farming than there were, I would offer to you, a decade ago, because people are understanding the connection between food and health and community and longevity and prevention versus trying to deal with the diseases we have in a Western diet. So I'm just, I am adamant about putting diverse voices at the table when it comes to speaking about these issues we're talking about today.
Absolutely. And I would just add, like, young farmers like Leanna, more native and indigenous farmers, they also need to be at the table.
Absolutely.
I'd really like to see some attention to logistics in the public interest. We've been talking a lot about food distribution and logistics, and that private sector spends a lot of money on logistics to make their businesses more profitable, but we don't have anything for independent businesses or businesses working in the public interest. I've seen a few things where, for instance, I saw that Iowa has a project doing logistics in the public interest for the state to try to determine where products are moving out of Iowa to other areas for processing, so that they can focus on state development of processing in those areas, so the dollars don't leave the state. And for anyone that's involved in meat production, the need for meat processing, especially at a small scale, is really, really big.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought up that last point, especially about meat processing. Chloe, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk for way too long about all of that, but since we're running out of time, I want to try to end on a more positive note. And so for everyone on the panel, we've been talking about how this has been a problem for a decade, but this is a new administration and there's a lot of new momentum in the food movement. So what keeps you optimistic when you're thinking about how broadband access could potentially expand?
I'll jump into that. So the thing that keeps me optimistic is that people are starting to work together, that whole issue around collaboration is critical. And I think we've got actually critical mass now to start to have these discussions and move to action. I think the new administration is in a position to really accelerate that, so that it's not just everyone trying to do it on their own, but to provide real leadership so that we can collaborate to make this happen.
I'll go next. I'm heartened by the increasing interest in taking participatory approaches to the design of technology, policy, community, etc. Whether it's thinking about human-centered design in the building of technology, or taking action research approaches when trying to think about how we actually do research in this context. And so these types of things, or open source development paradigms when it comes to actually building tools, I think these sorts of approaches, which to Michelle's point are collaborative ways of doing things, give me hope that we're going to be able to actually put some of these pieces together. I realize these are all things that in a lot of ways require broadband to also exist in certain places. So I am optimistic that we will, at least at some point, start to see broadband expansion in some more rural areas because people are asking for it.
I'm optimistic because, as awful as COVID has been, I'm seeing farmers of all ages who are willing to try new things because of it. I had an hour-long phone conversation with a farmer who was 71 on Friday, and I walked her through our whole software, and she emailed me yesterday and was like, okay, I talked to my husband, let's go, we'll do it. Which was just really exciting. And I'm excited to help her get her farm set up.
Well, I'll echo Leanne. Sometimes farmers will say, y'all come with technology to solve problems I really don't have. I mean, that was kind of a thing that guys used to say on the field. But what's incredible now is that I think the last bastion in which incredible leaps in technology can have the most impact is in the agricultural world. That, if you read things like American Dirt, where we just simply cannot maintain the way we produce food today, the earth just can't handle it and we can't sustain it, that technology is going to allow for us to maybe change a little bit and improve how we farm and how we, grow things, and both animals and crops, in order to help sustain the population that we have just in America and worldwide. And I think what's nice about this new administration, and why I am very optimistic, is America used to be kind of the leader of the global agriculture movement. We used to have the technology and send it abroad, and we sort of lost, I think, that edge in the last couple of years, because we lost sight of, I think, who we are and what's important in life. And so I'm looking forward to us once again stepping out and being the country that others call and say, hey, what are you guys doing about this? And that we will help others, because we're not an island in America. We need other markets to sell our goods to. We need other countries to help us as we have this climate change, because they've been growing food in the desert, or they've been growing food where they get tons of rain. So as a collaborative world, we need to step up and be a leader, but also at the same time, listen to what has worked for others across this planet. And I believe this administration will allow us to do that. And so that makes me very, very optimistic as a farmer.
Michelle, did we have a chance to hear from you? I'm sorry. Great. This has been such a riveting discussion. I just want to go back to one point that Ankita made earlier about the idea of participatory approaches to all of this. When I first started working in food and agriculture, and with Bernie, now 15 plus years ago, participatory approaches were seen as kind of cute and novel. And now we're really seeing them as the way forward, that they are the solution. And so, I didn't know if I'd see that in my lifetime. And it's so sort of, it makes me emotional that we're talking about these in real conversations, and that it's not, seen as novel anymore. It's seen as the way to go forward. And I don't know if we have the pandemic to thank or to blame for that, but it's one thing that I feel very optimistic and encouraged by. I want to thank Chloe for, again, being my co-moderator on this very wonderful discussion. We're out of time. All of you panelists have been amazing. I'm just really inspired by all of you and all of the work that you're doing every day to make the food system better. A reminder that this episode will also appear on our podcast, Food Talk with Danny Nierenberg, and we'll have the video available at foodtank.com as well. And I hope you'll all join us tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for our next panel on data protection and privacy. Thank you so much for being here today. And please stay safe, wear your mask, and stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.